But I can say to every woman who's lost a baby with 100% certainty that regardless of how you might be feeling towards God in the midst of your loss, He is full of compassion for you, full of love for you. And even if you feel like you're in a season of doubting that, it doesn't change the truth of it.
Hey everyone, welcome back to this season of Car Seat Questions. This is season 3. Today we're joined by Erica Kurscak. Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you guys?
Doing good. Erica, could you share with us a little bit about you before we jump right into our topic?
Sure. So I was born in Michigan, but when I was 5, I moved to the great state of West Virginia. And so I'm really a West Virginia girl at heart. I grew up as a pastor's kid, and from my earliest memories, I just remember always wanting to be with people any chance that I got, and always have kind of been fascinated by people's emotions and experiences. And so I went to Cedarville University to study psychology, and from there went to Westminster Theological Seminary to study biblical counseling. And while I was there, I met some wonderful people who introduced me to my husband, Nathan, and we've been married for coming up on 17 years. We have 4 kids, ages 6 to 11, and currently we're living in Akron, Ohio, where my husband is the pastor overseeing missions at our church, and I stay at home and homeschool our children and teach private piano lessons. So
Awesome.
That's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing with us. We met through Brian Dolan, who's the host of Mornings with Brian, for which I work at here in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And we got in touch with you because Brian had shared with me a ministry that you're involved in called Grace and Beauty. Can you share with us about Grace and Beauty a little bit?
Sure. Grace and Beauty is essentially a support group for women who are walking through infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, or the death of a child of any age. And so we have women of all ages that come and join us. We have just a small teaching time and a time for small group discussions and just encouragement. Every woman that's been there or that comes has been through one of those issues. And so it's just a wonderful time to support one another through a really difficult time that's not really talked about very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've shared probably in maybe 2 episodes of our podcast in the last 2 seasons that I had a miscarriage in September of, 2022.
Yeah.
I don't know the years anymore.
Yeah.
It happens.
Yeah. After having our first child, this is Trey. By the way, Trey is here with us, everyone. Trey, you want to say hi?
Hi, Trey.
What would a parenting podcast be if a child does not show up sometime?
So it's real. We do have a child. We talk about him a lot.
Yes, he's real. Just having a rough day. So I had a miscarriage after having Trey, before having our second son, who is now 3 months old. And when this happened to me, I'd had a couple of friends share with me their miscarriage or their wife had had a miscarriage. When I experienced it, I felt like, why is no one talking about this? Why is no one saying anything? Right. This is like normal. And this is a very isolating time. I didn't do anything wrong. I did not sin. I didn't do anything. So why is no one talking about this? And so I just decided I'm going to talk about it. And I'm not going to be ashamed of it. And I'm going to hopefully be a space for other people to feel welcome to talk about it too, so that they don't feel alone. And as I started telling people, whether it was, a colleague at work or one of my superiors here at Moody, I was telling him about it, and they would all come back and be like, oh yeah, my sister had a miscarriage, or my wife had a miscarriage, or my cousin, and I'm just like, why did nobody know? Why are we not talking about this? Why are we acting like it's some big secret? And so when we brought you on to the Mornings with Brian show, I was just struck by what a wonderful ministry Grace and Beauty is, because no one's talking about it. Mm-hmm. And you provide a place for women to feel seen and heard and known, in a place that's really, that's just there's just not enough voices for it. And so what made you and the team that you lead with decide to have this ministry?
Well, my own personal experience is that I had a miscarriage before any of my children, and then kind of dealt with some infertility issues for about a year and a half after that. And I was very alone and isolated, and I didn't tell anybody because I didn't know how. And I didn't know anybody else that had dealt with it, even though, like you said, so many people have. But kind of the reality of that loss struck me even deeper a few years later. I have a really dear friend who was pregnant at the same time as me with baby girls. We were due about a week and a half apart. And when she was 36 weeks, she found out that the baby no longer had a heartbeat. And I just remember the shock of that so vividly still. I never heard of that happening so late in a pregnancy. And I remember the devastation, even holding her hand in the hospital as she was waiting to deliver her sweet stillborn daughter. And I remember not knowing what to pray, what to say. I remember the anxiety for myself after that, of just my own pregnancy and the last 6 weeks that I had to go in my pregnancy. And so that was just a really dark time for me spiritually. I asked questions about God that I had never asked before. And I think that's just a really common response for women. So many people are questioning God, experiencing hopelessness and anger even. And that's normal. And it's okay to ask questions if you're asking them to the right people, to the right person, ultimately to God. And so fast forward about 4 years, and this same friend just really felt like the Lord laid it on her heart to start a support group for women who had experienced what she had experienced. And so she asked if I would be willing to write and teach a curriculum for that. And then, this is our 3rd year. So just been an honor for me to be able to walk alongside of a lot of these hurting women and to provide support and encouragement and just reminders of the truths that sometimes we forget in our dark seasons.
Yeah. Have you, working with women who've experienced child loss, have you kind of started to see why is it so stigmatized? Like, what is it about child loss that not only as the women who experience it feel shame or feel like they need to hide or not talk about it, but what else, like what in society is making women feel this way?
I think a lot of it comes down to our own personal sense of shame. Like we think, oh, there's something not working in me. I did something wrong. When the reality is it's just something that happens. It's not something that you can control. And I think even in Christian communities, a lot of times there's this expectation that once you get married, you're supposed to have kids within a reasonable amount of time. And so a lot of times people end up saying thoughtless, hurtful, even judgmental things without realizing it. Because they're just thinking, well, why haven't you had kids yet? You're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. Isn't that what God tells us to do? And not recognizing, maybe you've tried. Maybe you've had multiple miscarriages. Maybe you're struggling with infertility. And those questions can be really, really hurtful. Yeah.
We haven't really gotten to this stage yet because our son Trey is 3.5, but we want to start thinking about how do we tell Trey and soon when Ellis is older, Ellis, our second, about, you did have another sibling and they're not here with us. And obviously at 3.5, I don't think, Trey's ready to hear that. But I think we want to start preparing for how do we talk about that? How do you think, what are some good tips for parents to talk to their kids about child loss, even if that is someone who's has a 3-year-old and they have a baby who dies? How do we go about talking to our kids about this in a way that they can understand for whatever developmental age that they're at, and also in a way that's still honest and not holding back what's true?
I think it's important to say at the outset that it's an extremely difficult topic to discuss. There's so many women that are just walking through extreme pain that they can't even really explain or describe to people. And everyone's experience is so personal and so unique, that I think, as I was saying earlier, it's normal to question God. It's normal to feel angry and depressed and anxious and hopeless. And so the last thing that I would want to do in any of this is to put a Band-Aid on a broken arm, so to speak. But I can say to every woman who's lost a baby with 100% certainty that regardless of how you might be feeling towards God in the midst of your loss, He is full of compassion for you, full of love for you. And even if you feel like you're in a season of doubting that, it doesn't change the truth of it. So God weeps alongside of us. I mean, we see that Jesus wept at the grave of Lazarus. He was willing to allow himself to go through that experience to accomplish a greater good. And if that's true for God's story, then it's absolutely true for our stories as well. And the reason I feel like it's important to start with that foundation is because our emotions as parents are really the driving force for our children's emotions. Kids are super smart, and particularly when it comes to the emotions of their parents. So if you're sad, they will be sad. If you're angry, they will be angry. If you're feeling anxious, guess what? They're going to feel anxious. And they're kind of like little mirrors, so to speak. A couple little stories to illustrate that. My mom once told me that she was working in an elementary school during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And she was working with kindergarten and first graders. And the day after the attacks happened, she was on bus duty and she was watching these kids get off the bus. And some of the kids were getting off like totally fine, like nothing had happened. Everything was totally normal. And there were other kids who were just clearly anxious, terrified. And she asked the kids who were very anxious, she said, was mommy watching the TV last night or this morning? And every single one of them said yes. So a 5 and 6-year-old, they have no concept of terrorism. They don't know what that is, but they know that mom is really scared. And so they feel really scared. Another story on a more personal level, when I was driving home from the hospital, visiting my friend who lost her baby, my daughter was 3.5 years old at the time. She was sitting in her car seat and she could see me crying from her car seat. And she didn't say anything. She just started singing that little Daniel Tiger song about feeling sad. It's okay to feel sad sometimes. Little by little, you'll feel better again. And I just remember thinking, she doesn't know why I'm sad, but this is the only weapon against sadness that she can come up with. And it was very meaningful to me at the time from my daughter. But just recognizing kids have, they pick up on all of those kinds of emotions. So that being said, I don't think that we need to completely hide our emotions from our kids. If you're sad, if you're struggling, it's okay for your kids to know that. But we do need to be aware of their age and their stage of life. So toddlers and preschoolers really, they don't have any concept of death. They don't have any concept of life inside the womb. And so particularly if it's a really early miscarriage and mom isn't showing yet, your child probably isn't going to have any idea what you're saying if you try to explain it to them. So there's a lot of personal preference when it comes to when to tell your children about something like this. But I would say a good rule of thumb is if you have already talked to them about the fact that mom is having a baby and they've gotten excited about it, then, you may want to figure out how to explain that to them, that mom is no longer having a baby. But sometimes, if they're so young that they're just going to forget, then it's okay to not say anything. But I think that it's depending on the age of your children. You could just say something simple like, mommy's baby went to live with Jesus. And we're really sad about that because we wanted him to come and live with us. But we're going to trust that God's going to take really good care of our baby. And you could even take that moment to pray and let your child ask God to take care of your baby. And then you can just kind of step back and marvel at the childlike faith that you'll see. That for kids, that's enough. They don't need long theological explanations. And if they see, okay, mom's trusting God, okay, I can trust God too. And here's some proof of that. So again, if your child's really young, I wouldn't recommend even necessarily saying anything like that. My two older children were both in late elementary school before I told them about my miscarriage. And so my younger two, I think they've heard us talk about it, but I've never had an intentional conversation with them. You as a parent sort of need to gauge whether or not your child's mature enough to handle that kind of information. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I remember we had a friend who had experienced a loss, and I was crying about it with my friend, and Trey saw me, and he asked, like you said, like, "Mommy, why are you sad? Why are you crying?" And kind of starting to get sad himself. And I just said, "Mommy's friend is sad, and so I'm sad with her," you know? And he's quite a sensitive soul, obviously why he's here with us today. And so I think for us, it's going to take knowing when he's emotionally ready for it too, just because those things, sad things, affect him so deeply. So being aware of, is he emotionally ready to hear something that's sad? Especially I think now that he has a younger sibling and can understand that relationship and is like, oh, there's another baby that we've lost, So yeah, I think just knowing your child and knowing what they're able to handle, whether that's like actually understanding the concept or even emotionally being able to understand that.
Yeah, Erica, in your experience, what are some of the maybe more common responses from children when they hear, news of the loss of a baby?
Yeah, I think just the sadness. It's a sad thing to realize that you would have had another brother or sister that's not here. I think sometimes there's a question of why, which really that's the scariest question for a parent because we don't even know how to answer that question. We're probably asking that question as well. But it's important to, if your children are asking why, to simply remind them that we live in a world that's been overtaken by sin. This is not the way that God originally intended life for humans to be. Death was not originally part of the plan. And so we know that God can be trusted even when we don't understand why. There's actually a sweet little book that I love called The Moon is Always Round by Jonathan Gibson. And he gives this illustration throughout the book. The dad is asking his son, what shape is the moon tonight? And the son says, the moon is always round, no matter what shape the moon looks like in the picture. And then at the end, the dad said, so what does that mean? And the little boy who just lost his baby sister at 39 weeks says, God is always good. And so, we can't see in all the phases of the moon. The idea is that it's actually round, even though it doesn't look like it. And in the same way, we can't see what God is doing in our dark seasons, but we know that he's always good because we see it all through the pages of Scripture. He's proven that to us. So I think it's important to recognize and to explain to kids, we can't explain why, but we can know that God is good. And again, sometimes those simple answers are just enough for kids, especially if you repeat it enough times. Yeah. But I think another thing maybe that should be mentioned here in terms of children's responses is the reality of trauma, depending on what type of miscarriage was experienced. If mom was in obvious physical pain, or maybe there was an ectopic pregnancy that required emergency surgery,
Yeah.
And if the children are home and they witness that, it can be really traumatic for them to be, because they're going to be separated from their mom, and the last image that they had of her was in distress. And so if that's the case, I think then it's really important, once the crisis has passed, to have a conversation with your child. And you can just make it simple. And I think it's helpful to sort of like walk through the events of what happened with the child and reframe it in a way that they can see that everything was okay, because as they were walking through it, nothing was okay. And if it gets stuck in their brain that way, there can be a lot of trauma with that. So, I mean, this could be, for example, you just have a conversation with them. Do you remember when mommy was really hurting? And do you remember that daddy needed to take her to the doctor to get some help? Do you remember you got to have special time with grandma while mom was having special time with the doctors? Do you remember you got to go to that special ice cream place? What flavor of ice cream did you get? You know, what flavor of ice cream did grandma get? You remember when grandma prayed with you and you were feeling really sad? And did God hear those prayers? Yeah, he did. You remember when daddy came home, or when he came to pick you up and gave you that hug, the best hug in the world? Doesn't daddy just give the best hugs? Don't you just love daddy's hugs? And remember daddy took you home and you learned how to be really gentle with mommy, and it was kind of special. You got to take care of mommy instead of mommy taking care of you. And so you can continue with these kinds of conversations, just walking it through in a way that they can understand. And I would recommend continuing to do that until they can actually fill in the story for you. Say, oh, then what happened? Then what happened? And let them tell it. And when they tell it that way, it just changes the way that their brain processes that. And it changes it from a traumatic experience to just a story with a happy ending. And so if your child has gone through some of the trauma that miscarriage or ectopic pregnancy especially can cause, that's just something that I would recommend to help them work through that in their own heart and mind.
What are some suggestions of local resources or what a church can do to help parents that have experienced child loss in some way?
Yeah, so I mentioned that little book, The Moon is Always Round, by Jonathan Gibson. Another good one is called Goodbye to Goodbyes by Lauren Chandler. And that just deals with the concept of death for children. But I would say, just on a practical level for the church, think about Mother's Day. And Mother's Day is often a really difficult time for women who've had miscarriages or dealing with infertility. And so oftentimes there'll be somebody that goes up front and prays for all the moms in the room or recognizes all the moms in the room. So if during that prayer time they just mention prayer for the women who've lost children, it just speaks volumes to mention that publicly, to recognize, okay, I'm not forgotten. Feeling seen is just, it changes everything when you feel seen. And along those same lines, if your church has like a meal service that they provide, why not provide meals for women who've experienced miscarriage the same way you do for women who are new moms? Because if, going through a miscarriage, you feel sort of a lack of mental and emotional energy to even make meals and provide for your family that way sometimes. And so that can just be another way to help them feel like they're not alone. Oh, I have to have a baby if I want to get a meal. Well, no, not in our community. So, and then, we have found that our Grace and Beauty support group has been really, really helpful and beneficial for women. We're actually working on getting that to a place that it can be shared with other churches so that you could start your own Grace and Beauty group. But if that's something that the Lord's laying on your heart, I would pursue that, and maybe something that a lot of people will benefit from. And there's way more people in your community and your church that are walking through this than you probably realize.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you, Erica, so much for sharing your story with us and just sharing insights on how to gently care for this topic with our children and our communities around us. For the listener, be sure to check your podcast feeds every Wednesday, because that's when Car Seat Question drops into your feed. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss episodes, as well as give us a review. We only allow 5-star reviews, though. Nothing less, only 5 stars, please. Erica, before we send you off, we'd like to close with a liturgy.
To him who is able to do far more than we can understand, may he give us the wisdom to raise our children to first love God above all else and love others as themselves. Go in peace. Thanks for joining us this week on the Car Seat Questions podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment, and just let us know what you thought.
Be sure to follow us on YouTube, wherever you find your podcasts, Instagram, TikTok, basically anywhere, and drop your comments below about what you thought about the episode.